The ocean on a winter's night carries a peculiar power to silence everything around it. That pale half-moon hung suspended in the sky above, casting a thin, silvery ribbon of light across the restless waters of the Pacific. Wave after wave rose and fell in an ancient rhythm, seemingly indifferent to the massive conflict consuming entire continents far beyond the horizon. Only the wind broke the quiet, and even that arrived as nothing more than a soft whisper across the dark swells. To any sailor keeping watch on the deck of a Japanese destroyer that evening, the scene might have appeared almost peaceful, deceptively calm. But something moved beneath that glimmering surface, waiting with patient hunger. The USS Archifish cut through those black waters, a submarine of the United States Navy, 311 feet of welded steel painted in dull gray. When she surfaced, her conning tower became merely a shadow against the moonlit horizon. Her periscope and radar antenna barely disturbed the line where water met sky. Inside her pressure hull, the air hung thick and heavy, laden with the mingled smells of oil, human sweat, and machinery. Sailors moved with quiet purpose around valves and gauges, their voices kept low, their focus unbroken. These men had been waging war for years, yet tonight something felt different, something charged with possibility. Standing at the center of it all was Commander Joseph F. Enright, 33 years old, with dark eyes and a reputation that until recently had remained clouded with doubt. He knew the bitter taste of failure. During an earlier command, he had hesitated at critical moments, returning from patrol without firing a single torpedo. For a submariner in wartime, such a patrol was far more than merely disappointing. It was humiliating. Enright had even asked to be relieved, convinced that his instincts had betrayed him. That wound had stayed with him, influencing every judgment he made afterward. Tonight, in these dark waters south of Honshu, he intended to prove himself once more. Enright remained at the periscope, one hand resting gently on its grip, while the other touched the rosary beads in his pocket. Though not outwardly religious, this Catholic officer found solace in those worn beads whenever the weight of command pressed down upon him. And tonight it pressed heavily. To the north, beyond the headlands surrounding Tokyo Bay, a massive Japanese vessel was moving through the darkness. The radar operator had detected it first, a blip on the screen, 12 miles distant, holding a steady southwest course. The contact was substantial, distinctly large, and Enright's instincts told him this was no ordinary merchant ship. But what exactly was it? The Archifish had been assigned lifeguard duty earlier, standing by to rescue any American pilots shot down during air operations that never materialized. Now freed to roam these waters, she had stumbled upon something far more significant, though no one aboard yet grasped its true importance. Enright's mind raced through possibilities. The massive Japanese battleships like the Yamato and Musashi loomed large in his thoughts. Musashi had been sunk at Leyte Gulf mere weeks earlier, hammered relentlessly by waves of American bombers. Could the Yamato herself be out there? Or something even stranger, something new? The submarine shuddered slightly as she altered course. In the control room, men bent over plotting boards, tracing lines of relative motion with grease pencils. They worked with quiet intensity, understanding that calculations and timing meant the difference between success and death. A single error would not only cost them the target, but could invite destruction from the destroyers, almost certainly screening whatever lay ahead. For now, Archifish maintained her distance, shadowing on the surface, using darkness and a thin edge of cloud to mask her silhouette. Life inside the submarine remained tense, yet disciplined. The crew had grown accustomed to impossibly tight quarters. Torpedo men slept alongside their weapons in the forward compartment. Officers shared bunks in rotating shifts, and every man knew his station by instinct. A constant hum filled the air from fans and pumps, the rumble of diesel engines when surfaced. Many wore sweat-stained undershirts in the muggy compartments, stripped down against the oppressive heat. On nights like this, nerves sharpened every sound. The creak of the hull as seawater pressed against it from outside, the slap of waves against the bow, the faint buzz of the radar screen. Each noise seemed magnified by mounting tension. Enright was determined not to let anticipation become hesitation again. He had made that resolve months earlier, sitting across a poker table at Midway Naval Base. A senior officer had watched his aggressive betting and asked him directly, "Joe, would you command a submarine the way you play cards?" His answer had come without hesitation, yes. That answer had bought him this chance. Now, at the periscope, that chance approached its moment of testing. What Enright could not yet know was the magnitude of what lay before him. The vessel he was stalking was the Shinano, pride of Japanese shipyards, at 71,190 tons, the largest aircraft carrier ever built. She had been completed in strict secrecy, commissioned only days earlier, then sent into the night with skeleton crews and systems not yet fully operational. She represented defiance, a symbol of strength. Instead, she was steaming unknowingly toward a single submarine commanded by a man who desperately needed redemption as much as the Japanese Navy needed a miracle. The moon slipped behind clouds, darkening the sea around them. Aboard the Archifish, the men sensed the ocean grow even quieter, as though the entire world was holding its breath. Enright leaned toward the eyepiece again, and there it was, a faint silhouette, but unmistakable, looming against the horizon. He could see the escorts, darker shapes moving through the water around the main vessel. A destroyer suddenly turned sharply, racing directly toward them, and for one terrifying instant it seemed the hunter had become the hunted. Then, inexplicably, the destroyer changed course, wheeled back around, and resumed position alongside its charge. The opportunity remained. Enright whispered to his officers, his voice calm but edged with certainty. "Stay with her," he said. "Let her zig, we will find where she straightens out." His words carried not merely orders, but a promise, to himself, to his crew, to his own future. He would not hesitate this time. He would trust his instincts. He would attack. The clock ticked toward midnight. Somewhere ahead, the largest warship in existence moved through the darkness, completely unaware that beneath the peaceful surface, a submarine and her determined captain had locked her in their sights. The stage had been set. The game of patience, geometry, and fate had begun. By 1944, the Second World War had turned against Japan with relentless force. For the empire that once stretched from frozen regions to steaming jungles, survival had replaced expansion as the paramount concern. Japan now stood entirely on the defensive, battered from above by air raids, strangled at sea by blockade, bleeding from attacks on its outer island fortresses. The Pacific, once a protective moat around the Japanese homeland, had transformed into a shrinking battlefield. American forces had advanced relentlessly from island to island. The Solomons, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, then the Marianas. Each landing brought United States forces closer to Japan's heart. With every foothold secured, the Japanese military found itself forced to fight from weakened positions, spread thin, with diminishing resources and collapsing morale. By summer 1944, the Philippines campaign had begun. General Douglas MacArthur, keeping his famous promise, had returned. His forces pushed through island after island, while Admiral Chester Nimitz directed the vast Pacific Fleet on its steady march toward Okinawa. The oceans themselves had become actively hostile to Japanese shipping. Where once the Imperial Navy had dominated those waters, American submarines now ruled beneath the waves. These silent predators proved devastatingly effective. Submarines like the Archifish had decimated Japan's merchant fleet. Tankers carrying precious oil from the East Indies were sinking faster than replacements could be built. Cargo ships laden with food, weapons, and raw materials fell easy prey to submarines armed with nothing but patience and torpedoes. By 1944, Japan had lost more than half its merchant fleet, and the shortage was strangling the nation. Factories slowed production, fuel grew scarce, basic supplies became impossible to find. The mathematics of warfare had turned brutally against Japan. The empire could no longer replace losses in ships and aircraft. Each vessel destroyed represented an irreplaceable loss. The great shipyards that had produced the fleet, which struck Pearl Harbor, now struggled merely to patch damaged vessels, let alone construct new ones. Steel remained scarce, skilled workers had been conscripted into military service, and American bombing raids were beginning to systematically target industrial centers. Above the waves, circumstances were equally dire. The United States Navy had assembled carrier strike groups more powerful than anything previously seen. The fast carriers of the 3rd and 5th Fleets ranged freely across the Pacific, their aircraft pounding Japanese bases and striking the home islands themselves. The skies had become perilous territory. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress, with its enormous range, had commenced daylight bombing runs against Japanese cities. Tokyo and Nagoya burned under firestorms, and more raids were coming. The Imperial Navy, once the most modern and fearsome force in the Pacific, had become a pale ghost of its former strength. Its air arm had been decimated at Midway in 1942. Its battleships had been damaged in the Solomons and Marianas, and at the massive naval engagement at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history, Japan had thrown everything remaining into one final gamble. The result was catastrophic. Carriers like the Zuikaku, veteran of Pearl Harbor, went down. The mighty battleship Musashi was destroyed beneath relentless waves of American bombs and torpedoes. Though the Yamato, largest battleship afloat, survived the engagement, she emerged damaged and forced to withdraw. The human cost was equally devastating. Japan's experienced pilots, those who had executed the Pearl Harbor attack with such precision, were nearly all dead. Their replacements arrived hastily trained, often with fewer than 50 hours of flight time before being sent into battle. American pilots, by contrast, arrived at the front with hundreds of hours of training. The result was slaughter in the skies. Japanese aircraft were being shot down at ratios of 10 to 1, sometimes worse. Japan was running out of time, running out of ships, running out of options. Yet even in this desperate situation, the nation clung to one remaining hope: that a powerful new weapon could shift the balance, at least temporarily. That weapon was not another battleship or new aircraft design. It was a ship unlike anything the world had ever seen. A carrier so massive, so heavily armored, and so secret that the Allies had no confirmation of its existence. Her name was Shinano, after an ancient Japanese province. Born from the hull of a Yamato-class battleship, she was meant to be untouchable, a fortress at sea. Japanese planners believed that if this carrier could be completed and deployed, she might anchor their defensive line around the home islands. Perhaps she could carry enough aircraft and special attack weapons to blunt the American advance, possibly even to threaten the invasion fleets that were inevitably coming. The strategic thinking behind Shinano reflected Japan's evolving doctrine. The Imperial Navy could no longer dream of decisive fleet battles where superior training and equipment would prevail. Instead, they needed a ship capable of surviving American air attacks, serving as a floating base for aircraft repair, and delivering the new suicide weapons becoming central to Japanese strategy. OK rocket-powered kamikaze planes and Shinyo explosive motorboats represented a grim calculus. Japanese lives traded for American ships at what they hoped would be favorable ratios. But even as Japan built her, the realities of war closed in. Shipyard workers toiled in shifts exceeding 16 hours. Materials remained scarce, quality suffered, and deadlines pressed relentlessly. The Shinano's completion was rushed, so rushed that critical safety tests were eliminated. The Empire needed this ship, and it needed her now. In Tokyo, leaders clung to illusions. If Shinano could steam with a full air group, she might bring down swarms of B-29s. If she could reach the Philippines, she might disrupt MacArthur's landings. If she could simply appear off Okinawa or Formosa, her very presence might shake American resolve. The war was slipping away, but perhaps, just perhaps, one great ship could slow what appeared inevitable. Yet desperation proved no substitute for strength. Japan had already resorted to measures that revealed how dire circumstances had become. The kamikaze corps was not a sign of strength, but of weakness, an admission that conventional warfare was no longer possible. Young pilots, some barely out of their teens, were being instructed that their highest service to the Emperor was to die ramming their aircraft into American ships. It was a strategy born of despair, dressed in the language of honor. The seas around Japan had become anything but friendly. American submarines hunted the coastlines without mercy. Wolf packs of 3 or 4 boats coordinated attacks on convoys, sinking escorts and cargo vessels alike. In late November, as Shinano prepared to depart her shipyard, Dozens of submarines prowled the approaches to Tokyo Bay. They had divided the waters into patrol zones, each boat responsible for its sector, all reporting contacts to coordinate interceptions. Most would never even learn of her existence, but one would. That single encounter would determine her fate. The broader strategic picture was evident to any objective observer. Japan had lost the war. Only questions remained about how long the fighting would continue and how many would perish before the end. But for those caught within the machinery of war, sailors, shipbuilders, pilots, such clarity proved impossible. They continued fighting, building, and hoping, because the alternative was unthinkable. By November 1944, Japan existed as an empire under siege, waters patrolled by unseen predators, skies burning with firebombs, cities trembling beneath the certainty of coming invasion. Into that storm sailed Shinano, a colossal vessel, unready, untested, and burdened with an entire nation's last hopes. Waiting for her, unseen in the night, was a submarine commanded by a man searching for redemption. Every great warship begins as a drawing on paper, lines on a blueprint promising steel, power, and prestige. Shinano's story began that way, but her destiny would change more than once before she ever touched saltwater. She was conceived in 1940, at the peak of Japanese naval ambition, as the third of the Yamato-class battleships. These were intended to be the largest, heaviest, most formidably armed battleships ever constructed, designed to outmatch anything afloat in the American or British fleets. Their armor exceeded any other, their guns surpassed all others in size, their displacement dwarfed contemporary vessels. They represented an empire seeking absolute dominance of the seas. The Yamato class reflected a philosophical approach to naval warfare, stretching back decades. Japanese strategic thinkers, aware that their nation could never match American industrial capacity, believed in pursuing qualitative superiority. If Japan could not build more ships than America, it would build better ones. Each Yamato-class battleship would be worth 2 or 3 American counterparts. Their 18.1-inch guns could strike targets at ranges where enemy vessels could not respond. Their armor could withstand shells that would devastate lesser ships. 2 sister ships were completed to that original design, Yamato and Musashi, each mounting 9 massive guns capable of hurling shells weighing nearly 3 tons, with more destructive power than any naval artillery before them. These shells could penetrate 16 inches of armor at ranges exceeding 25 miles. Shinano's keel was laid at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, one of the empire's premier shipyards, with every expectation that she would follow her sisters into the Pacific as a floating fortress. Construction began with ceremony and pride. Shinto priests blessed the ground where she would rise. The emperor himself was informed of the project. The finest steel was allocated, the most experienced shipbuilders assigned. In original plans, she would displace 72,000 tons fully loaded, mount the same massive guns as her sisters, and cruise at 27 knots despite her enormous bulk. She represented not merely a weapon, but a statement of Japanese technical achievement. But wars reshape even the grandest dreams. In June 1942, Japan suffered a devastating loss at the Battle of Midway. 4 fleet carriers, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were lost in a single day, along with hundreds of experienced pilots and the backbone of Japan's naval air arm. That battle permanently shifted the balance of power in the Pacific. Japan could no longer rely on carriers to project power as it had during the early triumphs of 1941 and 1942. The loss at Midway forced a fundamental reassessment of naval strategy. Aircraft carriers, not battleships, had proven to be the decisive weapons of modern naval warfare. The age of the big gun was ending. The age of aircraft had arrived. Navy planners examined Shinano's massive hull, still incomplete in her dock, and faced a choice. Completing her as a battleship meant producing another gun platform in an era when carriers determined warfare outcomes. Leaving her unfinished was unthinkable. Too much had already been invested. The answer became clear. Shinano would be converted into an aircraft carrier, not merely any carrier, but the largest carrier the world had ever seen. The conversion was radical and extraordinarily complex. The lower hull, already shaped for a battleship's needs, had to be adapted for entirely different purposes. Her armored citadel, originally designed to withstand enormous shell fire, was reconfigured to support an expansive hangar deck. Where gun turrets would have stood, aircraft elevators were installed. The superstructure was redesigned, shifted to starboard in the style of aircraft carriers. A flight deck measuring 840 feet long and 130 feet wide was constructed above everything else. Unlike other carriers, she would not be built primarily to launch vast offensive strikes. Instead, she was envisioned as a support carrier, a mobile fortress capable of protecting fleets with her armor, repairing aircraft during battle, and carrying suicide planes and motorboats designed for special attack missions. Her hangar could accommodate 47 aircraft, with storage for another 70 in crates that could be assembled as needed. She would serve as a floating reserve, replenishing the air groups of other carriers that had suffered losses. This concept reflected Japan's evolving strategy. By 1944, Japan could no longer count on massing hundreds of trained pilots for conventional battles. The experienced aviators who had executed the Pearl Harbor attack were mostly dead. Their replacements were inadequately trained, often with fewer than 50 hours of flight time. Instead of conventional air power, Japan sought weapons of shock and desperation. Shinano would become their arsenal. The secrecy surrounding her construction was unprecedented. Fearing American bombers would destroy the ship before she ever sailed, the Navy took extraordinary measures. The dry dock where Shinano was being built was enclosed under a massive concrete roof, shielding her from reconnaissance aircraft. This roof, supported by enormous steel girders, transformed the construction site into a vast covered workshop. Steam hissed from her funnels as the massive carrier slipped away from her berth at Yokosuka Naval Arsenal. The workers who had built her, who had poured 4 years of their lives into her construction, watched from the dock as she moved into the darkness. Many of them believed they would never see her again. The 3 escorting destroyers fell into formation around her, their smaller silhouettes dwarfed by Shinano's immensity. Captain Toshio Abe stood on the bridge, reviewing the voyage ahead one final time. The route was simple enough, south along the Japanese coast, sweeping around the Izu Peninsula, then westward toward the Inland Sea and Kure Naval Base. The journey would take roughly 20 hours if all went smoothly. They would travel under cover of darkness to avoid American bombers, staying close to shore to minimize submarine danger. But nothing about this voyage had been smooth, and Captain Abe knew it. The crew moved through the ship with quiet tension. Shinano's complement had been assembled from wherever the Imperial Navy could find men. Veterans pulled from sunken ships worked alongside fresh recruits straight from training. Conscripted civilians stood at their stations beside career officers. Many didn't even share the same dialect of Japanese. The months of crew training that normally preceded deployment had been compressed into mere weeks, perhaps less. Damage control procedures, the crucial art of saving a wounded ship, remained poorly understood by too many sailors. When they practiced sealing compartments and manning pumps, confusion rippled through the teams. Men became lost in the labyrinthine passages. Equipment sat in wrong locations. Orders were misunderstood in the gloom of unlit compartments. Yet there had been no choice. The deadline had become absolute. The American submarine threat grew worse with each passing day. Enemy boats prowled Japanese waters in increasing numbers. B-29 bombers ranged farther from their bases in the Marianas with each passing week. It was only a matter of time before they found Shinano sitting at her dock. And when they did, all 4 years of construction would mean nothing. The ship herself remained unfinished. Captain Abe had compiled a list of critical deficiencies, 17 pages of them, and submitted it to Naval Headquarters with a formal request to delay departure. The response had been swift and dismissive. Shinano would sail as ordered. The Navy's reasoning was as much political as military. Word of the supercarrier's existence had begun spreading. She needed to depart as a symbol of Japanese strength, not be discovered by the Americans as a prize waiting to be destroyed in port. Of her 12 boilers, only 8 functioned properly. This cut her maximum speed from the designed 27 knots down to around 20 knots. Her radar systems operated only partially. Half her anti-aircraft guns lacked sufficient ammunition. The aircraft elevators that would raise planes from hangar to flight deck had never been tested with actual weight. Most troublingly, many of the watertight doors, those critical barriers meant to seal off flooded compartments and save the ship, had never been subjected to pressure testing. Nobody truly knew if they would work when the moment came. The crew assigned to Shinano reflected this desperate haste. Sailors who should have trained together for months had been thrown into formation just weeks before. There was no cohesion, no practiced rhythm. When officers ordered drills, confusion often followed. Men got turned around in corridors they'd barely memorized. Equipment appeared in unexpected locations. Verbal orders became muddled as they passed from mouth to mouth. Among the sailors, whispers about the curse persisted despite all official denials. Word had spread through Yokosuka about the launch disaster. The collapsed gate, the torrent of seawater, the massive hull slamming back and forth, the workers crushed and decapitated by whipping cables, 17 men dead, 43 injured. Some bodies never found, swept into the bay or destroyed beyond recognition. Ships with violent launches were considered cursed in Japanese naval tradition. The kami, the spirits that inhabited all things, had turned away from Shinano. The ocean itself had tried to reject her. Captain Abe, a stern and practical officer who had survived the Battle of Midway, had tried to suppress such talk. Steel and engines possessed no spirits, he had declared to his crew. Discipline and training won battles, not omens. But even as he spoke those words, he could see doubt in their eyes. Sailors were superstitious by nature, and Japanese sailors especially so. Many continued making private offerings at ship shrines, seeking divine protection against whatever curse they believed clung to their vessel. The repairs from the launch disaster had been rushed, like everything else about Shinano's completion. New plates had been welded over damaged areas. Bent fittings had been hammered straight or replaced entirely. Paint had covered the scars. Within 3 weeks, the external evidence of catastrophe had vanished. But those who had witnessed it could not forget. The image of that massive hull slamming back and forth, the screams of crushed men, the feeling that something fundamental had gone terribly wrong. These memories persisted among the workers and sailors alike. The commissioning ceremony on November 11, 1944, had been subdued, almost grim. No bands had played. Few dignitaries had attended. Captain Abe had read the official orders in a flat voice as the rising sun flag was raised on her mast. She was now officially a warship of the Imperial Japanese Navy, though hardly one ready for combat. The final days before departure had taken on a desperate, almost frantic quality. Equipment that should have been carefully installed was essentially thrown aboard. Crates of supplies were stacked wherever space could be found. The special weapons she would carry, 50 Oka suicide rocket planes and several Shinyo explosive motorboats, had been loaded into her hangars. These weapons, symbols themselves of Japan's mounting desperation, seemed appropriate cargo for a ship that felt cursed. Now, as Shinano moved into the darkness of November 28th, the crew faced the voyage ahead with a mixture of pride and dread. They were sailing on the world's largest warship, a technological marvel that had consumed 4 years of Japan's shipbuilding capacity. Yet they were also sailing on an incomplete vessel with an untrained crew, many of whom harbored deep fears about what they carried into the night. The escort force seemed woefully inadequate for the world's largest carrier. 3 destroyers, Isakaze, Yukikaze, and Hamakaze, fell into protective formation. All 3 were battle-hardened veterans, their crews experienced, but their ships were worn. Radar and sonar systems damaged in previous engagements had been only partially repaired. They would have to rely more on human lookouts than electronic detection. For protecting Shinano, it seemed insufficient. But every available destroyer was needed elsewhere, stretched across the Japanese Navy's shrinking operational strength. The night air was cool as the 4 ships moved southward along the coast. Navigation lights flickered to life on Shinano's vast superstructure. Steam continued rising from her funnels. On her bridge, Captain Abe watched the coastline slide past, knowing that somewhere in the darkness beyond the visible horizon, American submarines hunted. The voyage would take 20 hours if nothing went wrong. But as the great ship cut through the black water, no one aboard could shake the feeling that everything that could go wrong already had. And perhaps worse still lay ahead. Tugs nudged her massive bulk away from the pier. Her screws began to turn, slowly at first, then with gathering power. The great ship moved under her own power for the first time. Despite everything, the rushed construction, the cursed launch, the incomplete systems, she was magnificent. Her hull stretched nearly 900 feet. Her flight deck rose 60 feet above the water. She displaced more than most harbors could handle. By any measure, she was an engineering triumph. The three destroyers took up their screening positions. Yosokaze led the way, with Yukikaze and Hamakaze holding the flanks. Together, the four ships headed for the harbor entrance and the open sea beyond. As they passed through the submarine nets protecting the harbor, several crew members noticed something that made their skin crawl. A dead albatross floated in the water, its white wings spread like a surrender flag. None aboard knew that 30 miles to the south, USS Archifish was beginning her patrol. The submarine had been on lifeguard duty, positioned to rescue American airmen from a bombing raid that had been cancelled due to weather. Now, free to hunt, Commander Enriot had brought his boat to the surface to recharge batteries and refresh the air. The night was perfect for submarine operations, dark enough to hide their low silhouette, calm enough for good sound conditions, with just enough moon to spot targets. At 8:48 p.m., Archifish's radar operator called out contact. Bearing 020, range 12 miles. The blip on the radar screen was large, steady, and moving southwest at about 20 knots. Enriot rushed to the bridge, raising his binoculars. On the horizon, barely visible, he could make out a dark mass and the smaller shapes of escorts. His pulse quickened. This was no merchant vessel. The size, the speed, the escorts, everything suggested a major warship. Battle stations, Enriot ordered quietly. Throughout the submarine, men moved to their positions with practiced efficiency. In the forward torpedo room, crews checked their weapons. In the control room, plotting teams prepared their charts and calculating boards. The hunt was on. Enriot faced an immediate problem. The target was moving at 20 knots. Archifish's maximum surface speed was 19 knots. In theory, the submarine couldn't catch her prey. But Enriot knew that Japanese ships often zigzagged to avoid submarines, and those course changes would slow their advance. If he could anticipate the pattern, cut corners, he might be able to close the distance. For the next hour, Archifish pursued at maximum speed, her 4 diesel engines straining. The submarine vibrated with the effort, her hull cutting through the swells, spray breaking over her bow. Below, Enriot coaxed every possible revolution from the engines. The temperature in the engine room climbed past 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Men worked in shifts, rushing topside to gulp fresh air before returning to their stations. On Shinano's bridge, radar operators detected the American submarine almost immediately. The equipment might have been partially functional, but it worked well enough to spot a surface contact at several miles. Captain Abe received the report with grim satisfaction. He had expected submarines. The waters off Japan were infested with them, but he had plans to deal with this threat. "Signal the escorts," he ordered. Enemy submarine bearing 170, distance 8,000 meters. Abe's tactical situation was complex. His ship, despite her size, was vulnerable. She carried no aircraft to spot submarines. Her own sonar was not yet operational. She depended entirely on her escorts for protection, and he knew their capabilities were limited. The destroyer's sonar had been damaged in previous battles and repaired with inferior components. Their depth charge racks were only partially filled. Supplies were short everywhere. Moreover, Abe faced a dilemma. If he ordered the destroyers to pursue the submarine, they would have to leave Shinano's side, potentially exposing her to other submarines that might be lurking. American wolf packs often operated with one boat revealing itself to draw off escorts, while others moved in for the kill. But if he kept the destroyers close, the trailing submarine could shadow them, radioing their position to other boats or aircraft. Abe chose what seemed the prudent course. He would keep his escorts close and use speed and evasive maneuvers to shake off pursuit. "Execute zigzag pattern number 7, he ordered. The helm swung over, and Shinano's massive bulk began a series of course changes. 45 degrees to port, steady for 10 minutes. 60 degrees to starboard, steady for 8 minutes. Back to base course for 15 minutes, then repeat. The zigzag was a standard anti-submarine tactic, but it had drawbacks. Each turn cost speed and distance. What should have been a 20-hour voyage would now take longer. Fuel consumption increased, and most critically, the pattern could be analyzed and predicted by an experienced submarine commander, which is exactly what Enriet was doing. In Arkefish's control room, the plotting team tracked each of Shunano's course changes. Lieutenant Commander Robert Jinsky, the executive officer, bent over the chart table, measuring angles and times. "She's following a standard pattern," he reported. "If we cut across her turns, we can gain distance." It became a deadly game of geometry. Shunano would turn away, opening the distance. Arkefish would cut the corner, closing it again. The submarine couldn't match the carrier's straight-line speed, but by taking shorter routes, she could keep pace. It required precise calculation and iron nerve. One missed calculation, and they would lose contact. One detection by the destroyers, and they would face a barrage of depth charges. As the chase continued into the night, Shunano's incomplete construction began to take its toll. At 11 p.m., a bearing on the starboard inboard propeller shaft began to overheat. The massive shaft turning at high speed generated friction that the bearing couldn't properly dissipate. Temperature gauges climbed into the red zone. The engineering officer faced a terrible choice: continue running and risk catastrophic failure, or slow down and perhaps fall prey to the submarine. He chose to reduce speed on that shaft. Shunano's speed dropped from 20 knots to 18. The reduction seemed small, but it was critical. Now Archerfish could not just keep pace, but actually gain ground. On the submarine, the sonar operator reported the change in the target's engine sound. "She's slowing," he announced. Enriet permitted himself a tight smile. The geometry of the hunt had shifted in his favor, but Shunano's troubles were just beginning. The rapid zigzagging, combined with her incomplete construction, stressed systems throughout the ship. Electrical connections hastily installed began to fail. Lights flickered in some compartments. Ventilation fans stopped. The temperature in the lower decks, already uncomfortable, became stifling. Men working in the engine rooms had to be rotated every 20 minutes to prevent heat exhaustion. More seriously, the constant course changes caused the ship to roll and flex in ways her incomplete structure wasn't prepared for. Seams that had been inadequately welded began to work open. Not enough to cause immediate flooding, but enough to allow seepage. Water began to accumulate in some of the lower compartments. Pumps were started to deal with it, but several failed. They had never been properly tested, and now under actual use, their defects became apparent. On the bridge, Captain Abe received report after report of mechanical issues. Each one was minor in itself, but collectively they painted a picture of a ship coming apart under stress. He faced an agonizing decision. He could slow further, nursing his ship to port, but making her an easier target. Or he could maintain speed and risk more serious breakdowns. He chose a middle course, reducing speed to 16 knots and moderating the zigzag pattern. By 2 a.m. on November 29th, the deadly dance had continued for over 5 hours. Archefish had closed to within 7,000 yards of her target, still too far for a torpedo attack, but close enough to maintain solid contact. The submarine's crew was exhausted but exhilarated. They could sense they were gaining on their prey. Enriet studied the tracking data with intense concentration. Shunano's pattern was becoming clear. Despite the zigzags, she consistently returned to a base course of 210 degrees southwest toward Kure. If he could position Archefish ahead of that track, if he could predict when she would steady on that course, he would have his shot. "Take her down to radar depth," he ordered. The submarine slipped beneath the surface, leaving only her radar antenna above water. This reduced her speed, but made her much harder to spot. Now she was truly a hunter in the darkness, invisible but watching. On Shunano, the mood was increasingly tense. The submarine had been trailing them for hours. Why hadn't it attacked? Why hadn't it been driven off? Some officers suggested it was calling in other boats, that they were being herded into a trap. Captain Abe dismissed such speculation, but privately he wondered. American submarine tactics had evolved throughout the war. They were more aggressive now, more coordinated. At 2:56 a.m., fate intervened. Kazi, the lead destroyer, spotted what her lookouts believed was a periscope off the starboard bow. Without waiting for orders, her captain increased speed and charged toward the contact. The destroyer's bow wave rose white in the darkness as she accelerated to 35 knots. On Archerfish, the sonar operator's voice rose in alarm. High-speed screws approaching. Destroyer bearing 3 out 40, closing fast. Henriette had seconds to decide. Crash dive and probably lose his target forever, or hold his depth and risk detection. He chose to dive, but only to 150 feet. Shallow enough to resurface quickly. Rig for silent running, he ordered. Rig for depth charge. The destroyer passed directly overhead. Her screws thundered through the water. Every man on Archerfish held his breath, waiting for the splash of depth charges. But none came. Kazi had lost contact, and more importantly, had violated Captain Abe's orders to maintain formation. A sharp signal from Shunano's bridge ordered her back into position. The moment Kazi turned away, Henriette brought Archerfish back to periscope depth. Shunano was still there, still on course, now only 4,000 yards away. The opportunity he had waited for all night was at hand. At 3:15 a.m., everything aligned. Shunano steadied on her base course of 210 degrees. She was broadside to Archerfish, range 1,400 yards, speed 16 knots. In submarine warfare, it was the perfect setup. Close enough for accuracy, angled for maximum target area, slow enough for a good solution. Henriette made his final observations through the periscope. The carrier filled his view, massive beyond anything he had ever seen. Her flight deck stretched like a cliff face. Her island structure rose like a building. He could see lights in some of her portholes, the shadows of her escorts, the white water at her bow. He sketched quickly, recording her strange rounded bow, unlike any carrier in the recognition manuals. Final bearing and shoot, he ordered. Make ready all tubes. In the forward torpedo room, 6 Mark 14 torpedoes were ready. These weapons had been troublesome earlier in the war, with defective detonators and running depth issues. But the problems had been fixed. Now they were reliable ship killers, each carrying 600 pounds of Torpex explosive. Set depth 10 feet, Henriette ordered. It was unusually shallow, but he remembered advice from a senior officer. Against carriers, hit high on the hull where the damage would affect stability, not just cause flooding. The fire control party made their final calculations. Target speed, angle, distance, all were fed into the torpedo data computer, an analog device that calculated the correct firing angle. The solution was checked and double-checked. There would be no second chance. Fire 1. The submarine shuddered as the first torpedo left its tube. A blast of compressed air ejected the weapon, which immediately came to life, its propellers spinning, driving it toward the target at 46 knots. Fire 2. 8 seconds between shots, giving each torpedo time to clear before the next launched. Fire 3, Fire 4, Fire 5, Fire 6. In less than a minute, 6 death sentences were racing through the water toward Shunano. The torpedoes ran hot, straight, and normal, exactly as designed. Their wakes, barely visible in the darkness, drew straight lines toward the carrier's hull. On Shunano's bridge, a lookout spotted the wakes too late. Torpedoes starboard, came the cry. Captain Abe ordered full rudder, but the carrier's massive bulk responded slowly. She had barely begun her turn when the first torpedo struck. The explosion was tremendous. A column of water shot up alongside the hull higher than the flight deck. The ship lurched to port from the impact. Before the crew could react, the second torpedo hit. Then the third. Then the fourth. 4 hits in less than 30 seconds, all on the starboard side, all between the bow and the island structure. The first torpedo struck at frame 104, near an aviation fuel tank that was fortunately empty. The explosion tore a hole 20 feet wide in the hull, flooding adjacent compartments instantly. The second hit frame 142, destroying the starboard outboard engine room. Men on duty there were killed instantly as seawater and superheated steam filled the space. The third torpedo struck frame 166, opening the number 3 fire room to the sea. The fourth hit frame 190, rupturing another fuel tank and sending oil flooding through passages. For a moment, those on Shinano's bridge could barely comprehend what had happened. The ship shuddered with each impact, but she was so large that the torpedoes seemed almost insignificant. Captain Abe's first thought was that she could absorb this damage. After all, she had been built with a battleship's armor designed to survive multiple torpedo hits. But below decks, catastrophe was unfolding. The incomplete construction that had plagued Shinano now became fatal. Watertight doors that had never been tested failed immediately. Some jammed shut, trapping men in flooding compartments, others refused to close at all. Seams that had been hastily welded split open under pressure. Electrical panels soaked with seawater short-circuited in showers of sparks. The damage control teams responded as best they could, but they were fighting a losing battle. The men had never drilled together as a unit. Confusion reigned through the corridors. Orders flew back and forth, each one contradicting the last. Some teams raced to flood compartments on the port side, desperate to level the tilting deck. Others fought to pump out the water that was already inside. These opposing efforts fought each other tooth and nail, making everything worse. Below decks, the engine rooms had become a nightmare. Seawater surged into the starboard compartments at terrifying speed. Engineers stood in rising water up to their waists, then their chests, fighting to keep the pumps running. They pulled on levers, adjusted valves, anything to maintain power. When the salt water touched the electrical panels, explosions of brilliant sparks erupted. The men had no choice but to retreat. One starboard engine after another went silent. The ship's heartbeat faded away. The list grew worse: 5 degrees, 10 degrees, 13 degrees. Up on the flight deck, everything loose began to move. Aircraft that had been secured started sliding across the tilted surface. Equipment tumbled and crashed. Sailors linked themselves together in human chains, trying desperately to hold things in place, but it was hopeless. A fuel truck tore free from its moorings and smashed into the island structure with a tremendous bang. Ammunition boxes tumbled end over end into the sea below. Captain Abe stood on the bridge, his face a mask of control. He ordered more counter-flooding to fight the list. He changed course toward the nearest land, hoping to run the ship ashore before she went under. He sent urgent messages to naval headquarters with their position. Coordinates: 32 degrees north, 137 degrees east. They would attempt to reach shore. But Abe must have understood, deep in his heart, what the reports from below really meant. The water was winning. The pumps could not keep pace. Many sailors didn't even know where their damage control stations were. The ship was slipping away from them. Far below the surface, the Archerfish had gone deep immediately after releasing her torpedoes. Now came the moment every submarine feared most: the counterattack. Above them, Japanese destroyers were racing back and forth in growing agitation. Their sonar pinged through the water. Their crews armed themselves with depth charges. Down to 400 feet, the captain ordered. Rig for silent running. The submarine descended into darker, colder depths. Every man aboard went rigid. They breathed shallowly, barely filling their lungs. Above them, they could hear the destroyers, the high-pitched whine of propeller screws, the ping of active sonar cutting through the water. Then came the splash of depth charges entering the ocean. The first pattern exploded, 5 charges going off one after another. The submarine shook violently. Light bulbs shattered. Insulation rained down from the overhead in loose chunks. But the explosions were distant, at least 500 yards away. The Japanese sonar, damaged and poorly maintained, couldn't lock onto them precisely. More charges followed, 14 in total. Each blast sent shockwaves rolling through the water, rattling the hull, shaking the men to their bones. None came close enough to cause real damage. After an hour, the sounds from above grew quieter and more distant. The destroyers had given up their hunt and turned their attention back to their stricken carrier. When the Archerfish finally brought her periscope up at dawn, the horizon stretched empty. Whatever had happened to that giant carrier, she was gone. As November 29th dawned, the Shinano was in her final hours. The list had reached 20 degrees. Walking on the tilted decks became nearly impossible. Men grabbed ropes and hauled themselves up the slanted surfaces, their feet slipping. In the hangar deck, the suicide planes had broken loose. They slid into one another with sickening crashes. Their volatile rocket fuel presented an extreme fire hazard. The flooding had spread far beyond where the torpedoes had struck. This was what naval architects called progressive flooding, water finding paths through doors and vents, through cable runs and tiny openings, spreading like a disease through the ship's body. Compartments that should have been watertight were filling up. Thousands of tons of water were dragging the Shinano deeper and deeper. Captain Abe made one final attempt to save his ship. He ordered all remaining engines to full power, trying to drive the Shinano toward shore. But with only the port engines working, the ship could barely manage 10 knots. She moved in circles, unable to steer properly. The uneven thrust from one side left her rudder helpless. At 8:30 hours, Abe gave the emergency signal and began preparing to abandon ship. It was not yet an official order to leave, but a warning for everyone to be ready. Sailors began gathering on the flight deck, helping wounded comrades climb up from below. Life jackets were passed out to all hands. The destroyers moved in closer, positioning themselves to pick up survivors. Below decks, moments of genuine heroism played out against scenes of deepening tragedy. Engineers stayed at their posts, keeping the lights burning and the pumps running until the rising water forced them out. Medical officers worked in sick bays that were tilting at crazy angles, evacuating patients as fast as they could. In one flooded compartment, 30 men found themselves trapped behind a hatch that wouldn't budge. Their frantic hammering echoed through the ship for an hour before it finally stopped. The end came suddenly. At 10:18 hours, the list jumped to 35 degrees. Equipment, aircraft, and men began sliding uncontrollably down the flight deck. They tumbled into the sea. The order came through. All hands abandon ship. For many, the command had come too late. The list increased so rapidly that hundreds of men were still trapped inside. Others tried to climb the tilted deck, lost their grip, and fell. Some jumped from the flight deck, a drop of 60 feet. Many died when they hit the water. Captain Abe remained on the bridge. Following tradition, he would go down with his ship. He tied himself to the helm, resolved to maintain his dignity until the very end. Around him, his senior officers made the same choice. They stood together and sang the national anthem as the water rose around them. At 10:55 hours, the Shinano capsized. Her flight deck tilted past vertical. The entire ship rolled completely over. For a moment, her massive hull was visible above the water. Barnacles and red anti-fouling paint gleamed in the morning sunlight. Then, with a tremendous roar of trapped air escaping, she plunged beneath the surface. The largest warship in the world had been at sea for just 17 hours. Now the water where she sank was covered with debris and desperate men. Over 2,000 sailors had been aboard. Hundreds now struggled in water covered with oil. The three destroyers moved through the chaos, picking up survivors. But the rescue was far from equal. Naval tradition demanded that officers be saved first. Some destroyer captains, hardened by years of war, refused to save men who showed signs of panic. Save only the brave, one captain ordered his crew. The result was tragedy, compounding tragedy. Men who had survived the sinking drowned within sight of rescue ships. Others, covered in thick oil, were too slippery to grip and slipped beneath the waves. The winter sea was brutally cold. Hypothermia claimed those who weren't pulled aboard quickly. When the rescue operation ended, 1,080 men had been saved. The remaining 1,435, including Captain Abe and most of his senior officers, were dead. It was one of the worst losses of life in any ship sinking during the Pacific War. For Japan, the loss was a catastrophe, but it had to be kept secret. The Shinano had been classified as a state secret. Her loss would remain one too. Survivors were sworn to silence. The families of the dead received notices that their loved ones had died in action. Nothing more. Where or how they died remained officially unknown. The records were sealed away. To the Japanese public, the Shinano had never existed. But secrets are difficult to keep during wartime. American codebreakers intercepted Japanese messages and decoded them. Within days, they learned about the sinking. The name Shinano appeared in the intercepted traffic, along with the coordinates where she was torpedoed. Intelligence officers were puzzled. They had no record of any ship by that name. What had the Archerfish sunk? When Enright filed his patrol report in December, claiming to have sunk a carrier unlike any other in size, he faced skepticism. Navy intelligence insisted no such carrier existed. They credited him with sinking only a 28,000-ton carrier. Significant, yes, but nowhere near the reality. Only after the war, when American investigators could access Japanese records, was the truth revealed. The Shinano had displaced 71,890 tons when fully loaded. She was indeed the largest carrier ever built, and she remains the largest warship ever destroyed by a submarine. Enright's instincts had been right. His redemption was complete. The Shinano's single voyage carries lessons beyond the specific events of that November in 1944. It is a story about hubris and humility, about grand ambitions undone by fundamental flaws, about how the smallest predator can fell the mightiest prey when circumstances align. For Japan, the Shinano represented the failure of seeking a single decisive weapon. Throughout the war, Japanese strategists had chased the fantasy of war-winning weapons, super battleships, divine wind attacks, miraculous carriers. But wars are not won by symbols or singular weapons. They are won by systems. While Japan labored to build one massive carrier, America built dozens of smaller ones. While Japan rushed incomplete ships to sea, America invested time in training crews properly. The outcome was inevitable. The technical lessons were equally stark. Size without reliability is vulnerability. Armor without proper damage control is false security. A ship's true strength lies not just in steel, but in the training of her crew, the quality of her construction, the integrity of every weld and seal. The Shinano failed not because her design was fundamentally flawed, but because her execution was rushed and incomplete. For the submarine force, the sinking validated their entire strategy of attrition. Submarines, relatively inexpensive and operated by fewer than 100 men, could destroy capital ships worth thousands of times their cost. The silent service had proven what they had always believed. They could strike anywhere, anytime against any target. The submarine had truly arrived as a strategic weapon. Commander Enright's personal journey from failure to redemption resonated throughout the Navy. His story showed that one failure need not define a career, that persistence and courage could overcome past mistakes. He had faced his demons and emerged victorious. The Navy Cross he received was not just for sinking the Shinano, but for the determination to stay in the fight after earlier defeats. The human cost haunts this story. Over 1,400 Japanese sailors perished, many of them conscripts who had never wanted to go to war. They died trapped in flooded compartments, thrown from tilting decks, or abandoned in cold water. Their sacrifice achieved nothing. The Shinano never launched a plane in anger, never defended the homeland, never justified the resources poured into her construction. Today, the Shinano rests in 4,000 meters of water off Cape Omizaki. She lies upside down, her flight deck buried in sediment, her hull slowly collapsing under the crushing pressure of depth and time. She has become a tomb for those who died with her and a monument to an age when nations believed that bigger meant better, that one perfect weapon could change everything. Modern naval strategists study the Shinano as a cautionary tale. In an era of nuclear carriers and ballistic missile submarines, the lessons remain deeply relevant. Complexity demands competence. Size requires support systems. No ship, regardless of power, is stronger than the system that builds, maintains, and operates it. The sinking also demonstrates the role of chance in warfare. Had the Shinano sailed a day earlier or later, had the Archerfish been assigned elsewhere, had those torpedoes run deep instead of shallow, history would have written itself differently. War is not merely strategy and technology, it is also luck and timing. On that November night in 1944, all variables aligned perfectly for the Archerfish and catastrophically for the Shinano. In the years after the war, the story of the Shinano and the Archerfish became legend throughout naval circles. Authors wrote books, historians analyzed the engagement, veterans shared their memories, each telling added details and corrected errors, building the narrative that we know today. Commander Enright went on to have a successful naval career, eventually retiring as a rear admiral. He rarely discussed the sinking publicly, maintaining the quiet professionalism characteristic of the submarine service. When asked about that night, he would answer simply, "We did our duty. The torpedoes worked. We were lucky." Those who knew him understood that it meant everything. The vindication of his courage, the proof that he truly belonged in command, the second chance that he had seized and made his own. The crew of the Archerfish held reunions for decades. These aging men, once young sailors, would gather to remember their moment of glory. They told stories of the long chase, the tension of the approach, the thunder of the torpedoes striking home. But they also remembered the Shinano's crew, fellow sailors who had died doing their duty. War had made them enemies. Time had made them all simply men who had served at sea. Some survivors of the Shinano eventually shared their stories after the veil of secrecy finally lifted. They spoke of the chaos and fear of watching their mighty ship roll over and sink beneath the waves. They remembered Captain Abe's final moments, standing at attention as water rose around him. They remembered comrades who had fought to prevent flooding, who had given up their life jackets, who had pushed others towards safety before being pulled under themselves. In Japan, the Shinano became a symbol of the war's final phase, grand gestures that accomplished nothing, magnificent failures that only added to suffering. She represented the danger of believing one's own propaganda, of confusing appearance with reality, of rushing toward disaster rather than accepting defeat. For America, the sinking reinforced the democratic nature of naval warfare, that 80 men in a submarine could defeat thousands in a carrier, that patience and skill could overcome size and armor. It was David and Goliath, written in steel and torpedoes, proof that the smallest unit could achieve strategic victory. The wreck of the Shinano was discovered in 2019 by deep-sea explorers. The images they brought back showed a ship remarkably intact, despite decades underwater. Her hull, built to battleship standards, had resisted pressures that would have crushed lesser vessels. But she lies inverted, her intended glory forever buried on the sea floor, a monument to ambition that exceeded capability. Today, as nations once again compete to build the largest and most powerful warships, the Shinano's story remains urgently relevant. Technology advances, but the human factors that doomed her persist. Ships are still built in haste, crews still sail without sufficient training. Leaders still believe that one supreme weapon can change everything. The ghost of the Shinano warns against such hubris. The final lesson may be the most universal of all, that in war as in life, the race does not always go to the swift, nor the battle to the strong. Sometimes patience defeats power. Sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. Sometimes a single night's action echoes through history, teaching generations yet unborn about courage, folly, and the razor-thin margin between victory and disaster. On that November night in 1944, two ships met in the darkness of the Pacific. One was the largest of her kind ever built. The other was an ordinary submarine of no particular distinction. When the sun rose, only one remained. That is the nature of war at sea, sudden, decisive, and final. The ocean shows no favoritism to size or strength. It swallows all equally, keeping its secrets in the dark depths where the Shinano still rests. The largest warship ever sunk by a submarine, a giant felled by a predator she never truly saw.